There is a sound that used to belong to Sunday afternoons in Britain. Not the television, not the radio, something older than both. It was the sound of a mixing bowl being set down on a kitchen table, and a bag of self-raising flour being opened, and someone who knew exactly what they were doing getting quietly to work. The Sunday joint had already come out of the oven. The washing up was done. The dripping was cooling in its basin by the back door, and your nan or your mum or your gran or whatever name you gave her was already at that table with her sleeves pushed up, doing the thing she did every single week without being asked, without a recipe card after the first few times, and without any fuss whatsoever. 15 cakes, that is what this is about. 15 cakes that appeared on British tables every Sunday for decades, made from the cheapest ingredients available, with no stand mixer, no ring light, and no audience. Cakes that solved real problems: rationing, short budgets, dry fruit, restless children on a wet afternoon. Cakes that carried more technical intelligence than most people realize, and more emotional weight than any of us properly understood at the time. Here is something worth knowing before we begin. Despite wartime rationing, government data recorded British cake consumption at 190 grams per person per week in 1950. That is nearly 17% more cake than the average person in Britain eats today. People were eating more cake then. They just made it at home, from scratch, every single week, because that was simply what you did on a Sunday afternoon. This knowledge did not disappear because it stopped working. The cakes did not fall out of fashion because something better came along. They vanished because the transmission broke down. One generation stopped passing it on, and the supermarket bakery aisle stepped into the silence. At least one of the cakes on this list contains a scientific principle that food laboratories took the better part of 50 years to formally explain. Your nan already understood it by feel. She just called it Tuesday. Here are 15 cakes your nan baked every Sunday that nobody makes anymore. Starting at number 15. Number 15. Vinegar cake. The name puts people off. It always has. That has been the problem since the day someone decided to call it what it was rather than what it tasted like. Vinegar cake first appeared in British kitchens during World War I, when eggs and butter were among the first things to become scarce. By World War II, it was already a known solution. The batter came together quickly. Flour, lard or margarine, sugar, dried fruit, bicarbonate. Then the vinegar added last, the mixture fizzing briefly in the bowl. Once baked, there was no vinegar taste whatsoever. None. It baked off completely, leaving nothing behind except a moist, close-crumbed fruit sponge that kept well and cost almost nothing to produce. Vinegar cake first appeared in British kitchens during World War I, when eggs and butter were among the first things to become scarce. By World War II, it was already a known solution, passed between neighbors, tucked into community cookbooks, recommended in Ministry of Food pamphlets. The Women's Institute continued promoting it into the 1950s. As an economical Sunday bake for households where eggs were short or simply too expensive that week. The acid-base reaction that makes vinegar cake rise is the same chemical principle behind every modern eggless bake and every commercial cake mix on the shelf today. A woman in a back kitchen in Barnsley with a tablespoon of malt vinegar and a bag of dried fruit had worked out the same thing without a test kitchen or a food science degree. This was not poverty baking dressed up in clever language. This was applied chemistry that happened to live in a kitchen. She just called it the Sunday cake. Number 14. Dripping cake. This is the one that stops conversations. Made with beef dripping instead of butter. The fat that had been poured off from the Sunday joint into a white basin to set, the same basin that sat on the cool shelf in the back kitchen every week without fail. That sentence alone is enough to make someone put down their fork at a dinner table in 2026. It is also the reason this cake tasted unlike anything else made in a British kitchen. Dripping cake was common throughout the North and Midlands in the 1940s and 1950s, during the years when butter was rationed and beef dripping was abundant in any household that roasted meat weekly. The weekly joint produced it automatically. Nothing was bought for a single purpose. The dripping carried the flavor of the roast, deep, slightly savory, faintly mineral at the edges. Dried fruit and mixed spice were added to counterbalance the richness. By the early 1960s, butter became cheap and widely available again. Dripping fell from favor almost overnight, and dripping cake went with it. Not because the cake was inferior, not because the method had failed, but because prosperity when it arrived meant that creativity was no longer required. When you could buy butter without thinking about it, you stopped using what you already had. Consider what dripping cake actually represents when you look at it plainly. The Sunday joint at midday. The fat collected and cooled in the afternoon. The cake baked before tea. The tin carried through to the following week. One piece of beef used completely, from the first slice at the table to the last crumb of cake on Saturday evening. Zero waste, before anyone called it that. Before anyone wrote a book about it or sold a course on it. Modern zero-waste cookbooks sell this principle for £25 and market it as a revelation. Your nan practiced it every single week without naming it anything. It was just Sunday. Number 13. Boiled fruit cake. Before you do anything else, you boil the fruit. Sultanas, currants, mixed peel, simmered in water with a spoonful of lard for 10 minutes, then left to cool completely in the pan. The fruit plumps and swells. The cooking liquid turns dark and faintly syrupy. Everything goes into the batter together. The result is a cake that stays moist for a fortnight without refrigeration. Cut on Sunday, still perfectly good the following Saturday, stored in a tin on the kitchen counter covered with a square of cloth on the cool side of the back kitchen. One bake. One full week of something sweet at the end of every evening meal. The pre-boiling step was the technical secret, though no one called it that. It hydrated the fruit before baking, so the dried fruit did not steal moisture from the crumb during cooking. Dry fruit cake, the kind that crumbles at the edges and goes hard by Tuesday, is caused by exactly that. Unhydrated fruit pulls moisture out of the surrounding batter as it bakes, leaving the crumb tight and dry by the second day. That is food science. It was not discovered in a test kitchen. It was worked out through repetition in a scullery in Sheffield or Salford by a woman who did not like dry cake and paid close enough attention to understand exactly why it kept going wrong. No formal qualifications, no published paper, just the knowledge, passed on or lost. Number 12. Parkin. A dark, sticky slab, made with black treacle, oatmeal, lard and ground ginger, baked in a flat tin, then wrapped and left completely alone for 3 days before anyone cut it. That was the instruction, not a suggestion, not a rough guide. 3 days, because she knew what was happening inside that tin while the household went about its week. After baking, the treacle continued working slowly through the oat crumb. The surface softened. The whole thing became something different, stickier, darker, more complex in the mouth than it had been when it came out of the oven. The National Food Survey recorded oatmeal as a staple purchase in working-class households across the north of England from the 1940s through the early 1960s. Parkin used the same oatmeal that went into the morning porridge. The same treacle that sweetened the pudding on Wednesday. Nothing bought for a single purpose. Nothing that required a special trip to the shop. The smell of Parkin baking was close and heavy. Treacle and ginger in a warm kitchen on a Sunday afternoon. A smell that sat in your coat when you walked through the door, and stayed there all afternoon, and that you would recognize immediately today if someone placed a warm tin in front of you right now. Modern baking cannot sell you something that is not ready yet. Every recipe, every product, every baking kit sold online is optimized for immediate results, because patience cannot be packaged and shipped. Parkin asked you to wait 3 days. The people who waited got the better cake. The people who could not wait got something edible but not what it was supposed to be. That distinction mattered. That distinction was the entire lesson. Number 11. Seed cake. Caraway seeds baked into a plain butter sponge. That is seed cake. It sounds like an acquired taste, and to a modern palate it absolutely is, which is precisely why it has gone. Seed cake was a Sunday staple from the Victorian era through the 1960s, particularly in northern England and Wales. Jane Austen mentioned it. Charles Dickens referenced it. A Women's Institute survey from the early 1950s recorded it appearing regularly on Sunday tea tables in County Durham, Yorkshire and across the Welsh valleys. It was served with afternoon tea, not with custard, not with cream. A cake that assumed the person eating it was an adult with preferences worth respecting. The texture was close crumbed and substantial. The flavor was anise-adjacent, warm, faintly medicinal, grown up in a way that most modern cakes are simply not. The kitchen filled with a warm, faintly herbal smell as it baked, not the vanilla sweetness of a Victoria sponge, but something older and more considered. Something that expected you to sit down, take your time, and actually taste what was in front of you. We stopped making seed cake because somewhere along the way we began assuming that all cake should taste like a children's birthday party. Seed cake never agreed with that assumption. It has paid the price ever since. Number 10. Coconut pyramids. Desiccated coconut bound with condensed milk or beaten egg white, shaped by hand into tight pyramids on the kitchen table, baked until the tips turned gold. The shaping was done on Sunday afternoons with children directly involved. Every child pressed a palmful of the sticky mixture and formed their pyramid as best they could. The ones that held their shape went onto the baking tray with a small ceremony. The ones that collapsed were eaten immediately, on the spot, as consolation, which may have been the better outcome. A bag of desiccated coconut cost 4 pence in 1953. The condensed milk came from a tin that also served to sweeten the tea on a cold morning. The total cost of an entire Sunday afternoon's baking was under 6pence. There was a particular sound to it, the dry rustle of coconut against the mixing bowl, and then the silence of concentration as small hands pressed the mixture into shape, each child intent on getting theirs right, because theirs mattered. We now buy coconut macaroons in sealed plastic trays, uniform, untouched by any hand, produced in a factory somewhere and delivered to a shelf. This was not a simpler version of that. This was an hour on a Sunday afternoon that produced something to eat and quietly taught a child that their hands were capable of making things. That lesson had no packaging. The supermarket version has never taught anyone anything, and it never will. And if any of this is taking you straight back to a kitchen you still dream about, subscribe to this channel. Hit that button now, because the cakes coming next cost even less, and the stories behind them will genuinely surprise you. Drop a comment telling us which of these your nan made on Sundays, and if someone in your life needs to hear this, share it with them today. Number 9. Welsh cakes. Small, round, spiced and cooked on a bake stone or griddle rather than in an oven, which is what makes them unlike anything else on this list. Welsh cakes do not belong to the oven at all. They belong to the flat iron surface, the direct heat. The cook who knew by the color of the underside exactly when to turn them. Welsh cakes have been part of the British table since the late 19th century. They are tied directly to the South Wales coalfield. Food historians have documented their role as portable, sustaining food carried underground by miners. By 2007, a survey found that 85% of teenagers across Britain had never tried a Welsh cake, an entire food tradition centuries old, rooted in community, reduced to a footnote inside a single generation, not banned, not destroyed, simply not passed on. That is how these things disappear. Not with noise, with silence. Number 8. Rock cakes. They look like a mistake. They are supposed to. Rock cakes are rough mixed buns, flour, butter, sugar, dried fruit, a beaten egg, combined quickly with a fork and dropped in irregular heaps onto a floured baking sheet. The craggy, uneven surface is correct. It is not a flaw. Smooth rock cakes are wrong rock cakes. Any recipe that produces something neat and uniform has completely missed the point. From bowl to oven in under 5 minutes. Finished in 50. Started at 3 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, and done before the kettle had boiled twice. The Ministry of Food wartime recipe leaflets included rock cakes as an approved economical bake. The Women's Institute handbooks featured them through the 1950s as a reliable standby when time was short and the tin was empty. Today we pay £3.50 for a premium Rocky Road slice in a high street coffee shop, dressed with sea salt and dark chocolate, and served on a small piece of slate. Rock cakes cost 6pence and were ready in 20 minutes. They were never once apologetic about it. Number 7. Madeira cake. Plain, firm, close crumbed. Pale gold on top, with a distinctive crack running down the center that appears during baking. The name comes not from any ingredient but from the Portuguese wine it was traditionally served alongside during afternoon visits in the 19th century. Recipes for it circulated in Britain from the 1700s, but its real hold on the British kitchen came when Eliza Acton, one of the most important figures in the history of British cookery, published her version in her landmark book Modern Cookery for private families in 1845. That recipe shaped how Britain baked plain cake for the next 100 years. Madeira cake was the backbone of the Sunday tea table, the thing that was always there, always right, always capable of being offered to anyone who came through the door. We associate it now almost entirely with the shop-bought version, a slightly dry oblong wrapped in cellophane. That version is not Madeira cake, it is the shape of Madeira cake. The real thing, made at home with fresh lemon zest and baked until that crack appears across the top, is something else entirely. Number 6. Bara Brith, Welsh for speckled bread. A tea-soaked fruit loaf that sits precisely on the border between cake and bread, and belongs fully to both. The fruit, raisins, sultanas, mixed peel, is soaked overnight in strong cold tea, then folded into the batter the following morning along with the liquid. The tea is not drained off. The tea is the point. Bara Brith has been part of Welsh kitchen tradition for well over a century. It was a farmhouse bake originally, made by adding dried fruit, sugar and spice to the basic bread dough to produce something sweet for a special occasion. Then something happened. In 2006, The supermarket chain Morrison's withdrew Bara Brith from the shelves of 19 of its Wales-based stores, citing low sales. The following year, a survey revealed that 36% of teenagers in Wales had never tried it. Across the UK as a whole, that figure rose to 85% of all teenagers surveyed. An entire food culture, specific to a place, rooted in generations of Welsh kitchens, reduced to something 85% of young people had never encountered. That is erasure. Number 5. Honey cake. Dark, dense, faintly perfumed. Made with dark, runny honey instead of sugar. Honey cake was a wartime and post-war solution to the sugar ration, for households that kept a few hives in the garden, or had a neighbor who did, or knew someone in the village who traded honey for other things. The honey supply was the workaround when the weekly sugar allocation ran short. The smell of honey cake baking was unlike anything a standard sponge produced. Warm, floral, slightly caramelized, filling the kitchen with something that felt older than the post-war years. Something that connected that back kitchen on a Sunday afternoon to something much further back in the history of British baking. Modern baking demands immediate results. Every recipe is written for the moment the tin comes out of the oven. Honey cake asked you to wait 4 days for the best version of itself. The people who waited understood something that the rest of the world has since decided is not worth the patience. The cake was right. Number 4. Lardy cake. This is the one that stops conversations. Made with beef dripping instead of butter. The fat that had been poured off from the sundae joint into a white basin to set. The same basin that sat on the cool shelf in the back kitchen every week without fail. Lardy cake is a yeasted dough layered with lard, sugar and dried fruit folded like rough puff pastry, proved in a deep tin, then baked until the base caramelizes in its own rendered fat. It comes out of the tin upside down. The surface that was pressed against the bottom of the tin is now the top, dark, sticky, slightly crisp at the edges, the interior soft and laminated and yielding. It was a regional baker's cake, rooted in Wiltshire, Oxfordshire, and parts of the Midlands. A block of lard cost 4p. It was the correct fat for this cake, and no other fat produced the same result. Lard, and only lard, produces what lardy cake is supposed to be. The feel of it coming from the tin was of something heavy and warm. It was not a healthy cake. It was never presented as one. It was the cake that said, "Work is done, sit down, this is Sunday afternoon." The lard and the sugar and the slow yeast had collaborated to produce something that tasted exactly like rest. Number 3. Butterfly cakes. You already know what these are. You may not have thought about them in years, but the moment the name is said out loud, something comes back. The small round fairy cake with its top sliced off and cut into 2 halves. The halves pressed into a layer of buttercream at an angle, like wings. The small dusting of icing sugar across the whole thing, applied with a teaspoon by someone very small who was very proud. Every British mother baked in the 1950s and 60s. Rock buns and jam tarts were consistently cited as among the first things children were taught to make. Butterfly cakes were part of that same initiation into the kitchen, that early understanding that your hands could produce something from ingredients that were nothing on their own. They have almost entirely vanished from home kitchens. Not from shop shelves, but from kitchens, from Sunday afternoons, from the particular atmosphere of a small person standing on a chair with icing sugar on their nose. They are gone. That is an entire category of experience that a generation grew up without. Number 2. Dundee cake. A rich fruit cake topped with concentric rings of blanched almonds laid out in perfect circles before baking. Less dense than a Christmas cake. Packed with dried fruit and a measure of whiskey added to the batter. The Keeler Marmalade Company of Dundee is often credited with popularizing the recipe commercially in the 19th century. What matters is what it meant on a Sunday table. A proper bake. One that required time and attention and the correct arrangement of almonds. A cake that announced itself. A cake that said this household takes Sunday seriously. It is now largely confined to Christmas tins. The cake did not change. The habit around it did. And now, number 1. The plain Victoria sponge made with margarine, not butter. Margarine, that single word has been enough to end the conversation in certain circles. Equal weights of margarine, caster sugar, self-raising flour, and eggs, beaten together until pale, divided between 2 greased tins. And the margarine version, this is the part that surprises people, was lighter than the butter version. Food scientists would eventually confirm what those kitchens already understood. The lower melting point of vegetable-based margarine produces a more even crumb and a lighter texture. The Victoria sponge being made every Sunday in a kitchen in Wolverhampton or Wakefield was by that measure structurally superior to much of what is sold in patisseries today for £4 a slice. The woman at that kitchen table was producing a technically superior product without caring about the science. The science was not the point. The point was the cake itself, and what the cake meant. It was the cake that said, "This family is here. This Sunday afternoon belongs to us. We made this ourselves, and it is enough." Exactly what this day was supposed to produce. That is not nostalgia. Nostalgia is what you feel when you miss something you cannot get back. This is the recognition that what was lost was not ordinary and did not need to be improved upon. It needed only to be continued. And somewhere along the line it was not. 15 cakes. Every one of them real. Every one of them earned. Made by women who understood chemistry without calling it that. Who understood food science without a degree. Who understood the relationship between patients and result in a way no baking show has ever captured. The knowledge that lived in those hands was not written down in time. Much of it was not written down at all. It was demonstrated, watched, absorbed, and then either passed on or lost. And the record of how much was lost is found in the absence. In the empty Sunday afternoon. In the tin on the shelf with nothing in it. Here is what remains possible. The rock cakes are 20 minutes from bowl to oven. The Victoria sponge takes under an hour. None of these require equipment you do not own. Pick one this week. Just one. Make it on a Sunday afternoon the way it was always meant to be made. As a cake. For the people in your house. If you remember any of these from your own Nan's kitchen, tell me in the comments. Tell me which one she made. Those comments are the closest thing we have to writing it down now. Leave a like. It helps more people find their way back to these kitchens. Some things are worth remembering together. I will see you next week. Drop a comment telling us which of these your Nan made on Sundays. And if someone in your life needs to hear this, share it with them today.